I also think it's important when we get in settings, when we're speaking about sexual assault, that as of course you know, it's a very hard topic. 1 in 5 or 1 in 3 women experience sexual violence. We know that often there are folks sitting with us. We ourselves have our experiences of violence. And so if you need to take care of yourself and step out, feel free to do so. If you want to talk with one of us after the panel, we'll be available as well. So I think one of the great powerful things about the Me Too movement has just been to kind of show how prevalent the issue of sexual assault is. The awareness building has been incredible. And so when we have the opportunity to talk about it, it's important that we realize that we're talking about ourselves and our families and our communities, and we want to make sure we don't set the idea that there's a dichotomy between professionals and survivors. We know that we're all of those things, but today, of course, we're wearing the hat of a professional in the field. But we're proud to be a part of a movement that's about 70% survivors, and so yeah, that makes us a really special movement. But we will be talking more about the formal side today. So, with that said, the first question, if you all could introduce yourselves and tell us how you got into the sexual assault intervention, the trauma or crisis intervention work.
I go first. My name is Jenny Black. I'm the Director of Forensic Nursing at the Safe Alliance here in Austin. I have been a nurse since 2003 and started working in that field in labor and delivery, and was honestly kind of taken aback at the practices that I saw in that field. There was not really a whole lot of informed consent. There was not really a whole lot of, here's why you landed in the hospital today, when people were sent in from the city's clinic system. There was not a whole lot of, well, let me explain to you what we're going to do and what's going on with what you came in for today. And I took all those disappointments in that system, and we kind of turned everything in a completely different direction in this little clinic that we are doing in Austin now.
So my name is Andrea Perry. I am a sexual assault survivor advocate. I work with Jenny. My training is in philosophy. So my dilemma as a person moving through the world is something like, do I sit around and think about virtue and ethics and the meaning of things, or do I go out there and try to bring some of that into the world? And seeing as how we're not at a philosophy conference right now, I've clear that I've chosen the latter rather than the former. So the thing that I have always been interested in across disciplines is, how do you speak really well about things that are hard to speak really well about? I think that's one way to think about where we are in a conversation about sexual violence in general. How do I really talk about this well? How do I do it justice? What do I do with that understanding? So that ultimately is what keeps me in the field.
Hi, my name is Emily LeBlanc, and I'm currently working as the Chief Program Officer for CASA of Travis County. I started my career as a therapist working with teenagers with substance abuse issues, and it took me about 24 hours to realize that 12-year-olds don't get addicted to heroin unless there's some sort of trauma in their background. So I've pretty quickly started to specialize in trauma, specifically abuse, and then worked for SAFE for about 7 years, which is where we started the clinic, before I moved on to CASA, where I work with survivors of child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence.
Thank you. So now, so the title is Radical Empathy. So if you could each explain what that means to you, and then we'll talk a little bit about Eloise House, the program here in Austin.
I'll go first. I looked up radical in preparation for this question, and Google says that you define radical as affecting the fundamental nature of something. And I really loved that definition, because when I thought about what radical empathy means to me. To me, it's more than just feeling something. So when I started, my career as a therapist, trying to help one survivor at a time heal, and a big part of that is being able to feel, where someone's coming from and relate to them and connect to them. But very quickly, I realized that I needed to do more than feel one person's pain at a time, and made the transition into systems work and systems change. So to me, radical empathy is empathy in action. It's doing something to change the fundamental nature of the trauma that the survivors we're working with has experienced. And that requires more than just understanding or feeling with them. It requires being willing to challenge the systems that are re-traumatizing them, and being willing to change those systems into healing places, so that we can really get at the fundamental nature of what they've experienced.
I think it's helpful because that sets us up for thinking about, this was my first question, like, okay, well, radical empathy sounds really great. What would unradical empathy mean? What would normal kind of pedestrian empathy? Imagine that as a thing. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But the idea that, I like this distinction between something you might call emotional empathy and something you might call cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy is the one where I think we often get slotted into the idea that I'm going to feel your pain, right? There's a lot of power there, absolutely. But on the other hand, what I think we want to do with the distinction, cognitive empathy, it's something like, I want the data. I want to know what's going on. I want something actionable. If I walk past you and you're in a lake and you're drowning, and I'm not really necessarily going to need to know what it feels like for you to be drowning. I'd actually like to know that you're drowning, and then I'd like to do something about it. I think that's a big part of what we're able to do in our service model now that I think there were some challenges with before. We'll get into that, but that's my sense of the phrase.
So for me, it has to do with the way that healthcare is provided in this country and my experiences in it. When I was working in an emergency department, we had people providing care there who were not happy to be there. We had patients who were not happy to be there. Working in that system is really difficult because the demands are very, very high. You have to see a lot of people in a very short amount of time and turn rooms over so that the facility can make money. And I saw that burning people out. I saw my colleagues treating patients as if they were not really people. They know the drug seeker down there in room 7, or those kinds of things, and it broke my heart. I didn't want to participate in a system that functioned like that, that just crushed the workers in it into people that couldn't relate to other people anymore. So when this opportunity came up and we thought about, well, how can we do things in a way that's different? How can we do this in a way that it provides goodness for the people that we're taking care of, but also provides goodness for the people who are doing the work? And for me, it kind of comes down to love. I know that's not a popular term in any sort of healthcare or academic setting, but we bring love to our patients and we bring love to each other as we do this work, and it's working really well.
All right, so before I ask, or we start talking a little bit about Eloise House, I wanted to kind of set a little bit of a picture about sexual assault response in most places of the state, which is survivors experience the crisis or are assaulted, and then they go to a hospital traditionally and get a forensic exam. And then from there, maybe law enforcement meets them at the hospital. Maybe then they meet with an advocate who's there to support them through the process. And then that advocate connects them to resources. But Eloise House kind of flattens that structure a bit and provides advocates and that hospital space within an organization that supports survivors. So, but traditionally, there's several more steps, which is just to kind of set that picture a little bit. So tell us the story of Eloise House and how it embodies your ideas around radical empathy.
So in 2013, the Texas legislature passed a law called Senate Bill 1191 that required every hospital in Texas to offer sexual assault forensic exams, which in theory was a great idea because we had survivors, especially in rural areas, driving for hours to get care. And sometimes not even able to access care for hours, if not days. And in Travis County, we have what's called the Sexual Assault Response and Resource Team, which is where all the professionals involved in response to sexual assault, so law enforcement, prosecutors, the Rape Crisis Center, known as SAFE, lawyers, hospitals, all come together to kind of problem solve how we can make things better for survivors. And so that group started pretty early on when that law passed, trying to figure out how we could get all of the hospitals in Austin covered. At that time, we had one designated hospital where survivors could go to get a sexual assault forensic exam, where they often waited for hours, if not days, and often got a pretty substantial medical bill. The nurses working out of that facility did not have the capacity or, frankly, the will to expand to other hospitals at the time. So we knew we needed to come up with a new model, or at least an alternative model, in order to get the whole city covered, because at best, we would have survivors with 2 hospital bills if they got transferred from one hospital to another because they were being told they could go anywhere, and that wasn't reality. At worst, they would be waiting for days or unable to access an exam. So during that time, Jenny and I started talking. Jenny's a nurse, forensic nurse, known all over town as the best in town. And we started to brainstorm, what could we do differently? How could we get all of our other hospitals covered? And I worked for the Rape Crisis Center at the time and had been given the advice by my mentor, whatever you do, do not start a forensic nursing program. Because it was a really hard thing to do and a really messy thing to do. There's a lot of politics involved. So it was good advice that I chose not to follow. And Jenny and I started talking about, with the support of the Rape Crisis Center, could we start our own nursing group to cover the other hospitals, thinking that we would remain a hospital-based program. And then, we knew that we had to act fast because we already had survivors being told they could go anywhere. We had to think really strategically because there was already established politics that involved, prosecutors and law enforcement and hospitals, all of which have a lot of power. And we had to think collaboratively because we had to get all of those entities to work together to come up with a solution. And as we really thought through what that would look like, we decided we should dream bigger. And it wasn't good enough that we would cover all of the hospitals and still have the same problems of survivors, having to see doctors they didn't really need to see and getting medical bills for treatment they didn't really need or that they could have gotten or should have gotten for free. So we decided instead to start what is now known as Eloise House. So we started a forensic clinic that is housed at the Rape Crisis Center at SAFE, where survivors could come. We hired nurses and trained them to be able to do forensic exams on the property at SAFE so that they would never have to set foot in the hospital if they chose not to. They would never get a medical bill for the forensic exam. And so that we could really break down the barriers, we knew from talking to survivors that they weren't given a lot of choices in the hospital. If you've been in the emergency room, you know that. Nobody asks you what you want. They just tell you what's wrong with you and what they're going to do about it. And that is incredibly not empowering to survivors. So we wanted to make sure that they had choices. And we stayed really aligned about that. And so we thought if we brought it in-house to the Rape Crisis Center, the shelter's right there. We know survivors a lot of times need shelter after their assault, but rarely would survivors want that or take advantage of it from the hospital setting. But we thought, if we could walk them across the parking lot and let them see, this isn't a scary place, it's a really safe place, it's a really happy place. Your kids can come here, we can help you, that maybe they would take better advantage of it. We also thought we had legal services, and we know a lot of survivors have civil legal needs to represent them in the criminal case or to help them get out of a lease where they're not safe, or a variety of civil legal needs, protective orders. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be great if the attorneys were already here and they could talk to them on site? And we also thought, there was something fundamentally different about the advocates being the ones in power in that clinic. Because it was on SAFE's property, law enforcement had to follow SAFE's protocols to get in the gate. And that really gave the survivor control they didn't have before about whether or not they reported their assault. And they were able to decide either I just want medical care, or I want medical care and I want to report to law enforcement, or I want to get an exam but not report yet. I want you to store my evidence and let me think about it for a while, or I want to sleep. I'd like to take a nap because it's been a really rough 12 hours after a rape. That's how Eloise came to be. When we thought we had a lot more time, and then the nursing group that was operating out of the one hospital in town quit and gave 60 days notice. And at that point, we had exactly one nurse, and it was Jenny Black. And so in 60 days, she hired and trained a bevy of nurses. And we didn't have a clinic, we didn't have a building, we didn't have a plan. At some point, we thought we were going to get a van and outfit it as a kind of roving clinic. I think at some point we even talked about a futon in Jenny's living room because we were worried that survivors in Austin, we have roughly 10,000 sexual assaults a year in Austin, about 1,000 of which get reported. And so we thought we're going to have 1,000 survivors with nowhere to go. We've got to figure something out. Instead, we converted a room in the shelter at SAFE to become an exam room until we could get a proper construction trailer converted into a forensic clinic, which is now 2 buildings strong. We thought in our first year we would see 100 survivors. We saw 60 in the first month, and that number has grown exponentially. We knew we would have more people choose to store evidence and not report, which is an option if you're sexually assaulted in Texas. We averaged like 1 or 2 a month, and we had 6 or 7 in that first month, so we knew that broke down a barrier. And then the number of survivors choosing to go to shelter went up like 800%. So we knew that was also a barrier that was broken down. And I'll let Jenny tell you more about.
Sure. So in the system that we had previously, we would see about 485, these are adults and adolescents we're talking about in our particular program. In the hospital, I worked in that system before we opened up Eloise House. And it had stayed at about that number for the previous 3 or 4 years. Our first year we were in operation, we saw almost 600 people. So we knew that, as Emily said, that there were some barriers that we had taken out of the way for people seeking care after a sexual assault. We saw a lot more people who made a decision to have evidence collected but not report to the police at that time. And for us, that's almost a litmus test that we are doing a good job of providing informed consent to people. We don't have an agenda as nurses other than people's health and people's safety. We're not investigators, so we're not invested in getting more people to talk to the police. We're not invested in knowing like who and what was the car and tell me more details about all the things that happened. We are really just there to help people figure out how they might want to start navigating the system and providing health care and options to them at that point. One of the things that we started to do differently when we opened at Eloise House was to offer almost a menu of services and explain what all these were and answer people's questions before we moved forward with anything. Most people come into us and they're worried about their health. Am I okay? Did I get exposed to something? Am I going to end up with HIV because of this? And that's the #1 burning question for most of the people that we take care of. So we started to think, okay, well, maybe people just want medical care. And it turned out that a significant number of people that were coming to us just chose to have antibiotics to prevent sexually transmitted infections, medicine for pregnancy prevention, and then whatever other kind of exam they were interested in. If somebody was concerned about a body part, one of the nurses would take a look at that and let them know if everything looked okay or if we recommended some follow-up care someplace for them. So we started offering just medical care. in our menu of services. We also offer a report to law enforcement because not everybody that comes to see us has already hit that professional response system. We'll sit down and have a conversation about what does that mean? What does that obligate you to? What happens next? How long does it take? What happens after this part? And that's been very helpful for the people that we're taking care of. The third thing that we offer is an evidence collection exam. That takes about 4 hours on a good day. It can take longer if somebody has a lot of injuries that need to be documented, or if somebody's in such a terrible space that it takes a lot of extra conversation just to kind of gentle through the process. And as we move through this process, we are seeking informed consent at every step of the way. When we explain to somebody what I'd like to do next is comb through your hair, the reason why we do that is because sometimes stuff gets caught up in people's hair, like fibers or grass or other people's hair, and I have this like little paper towel that I like to drape over your shoulders and this generic black comb that I'm going to use to comb through your hair. Is it okay if we do that? So every piece of evidence collection, every piece of medical care, we're seeking consent from that person who has had choice taken away from them. And I think that's a great way to give people back their power. We did that in our hospital system, but we have raised the level at which we're doing that in the current system, and it's much better. So we've got medical care, we've got talking to the police, we've got evidence collection exams, and for adults in Texas, you don't have to talk to the police before you have evidence collected. For minors, it's a mandatory law enforcement report, so we have different pathways depending on who it is that we're taking care of. The fourth thing that we want to talk with people is about is support. Like, what do you already have in your world in existence, and where might we be able to fill in the gaps? Emily mentioned civil legal services, and that was something as a nurse who worked in an emergency department, it never crossed my mind that the patients we were taking care of might benefit from a consult with a lawyer to talk to them about, if I talk to the police about this rape, am I going to be able to keep my kids safe? How is it going to affect my child custody issues? Those kinds of things that we don't have answers for, but we were able, in this wonderful agency where we landed, to be able to pull in services that we never thought we were going to need. So after we talk with folks about support, we are also participating in a study that's NIH funded, that's out of the University of North Carolina, that is looking at how do people respond after a sexual assault? How do people recover? What kind of PTSD rates are happening? So when people are eligible for participation in that study, we'll have a little conversation with them, and then the study follows them up for a year to ask them how they're doing. How's it working for you in the system? How's your body doing? Where are you having pain? It's a really interesting study, and we hope to be able to come back and share more information about that next year. Enrollment ends sometime in the middle of this year. And I want to highlight the last thing that we offer to people, because I think this is a radical approach. We say, if none of that sounds like a good idea to you, we're not going to do any of this. This is your choice. We're here to help you understand what the consequences are of choosing any of the things that we might offer, but it's totally fine with us if you don't want to do any of the things that we have to offer. And if you want to come back later and talk with us another time, that's fine. If you want us, we'll call you and check in on you in a few days and see if you might want to continue this conversation. So I think that's another little piece of what's radical that we're doing. So as we progressed into our first year in these services, we saw that people fell into 3 general categories. Some people wanted to have the full evidence collection exam, and that's most of the people that we see. A small proportion wanted just medical care, and a littler proportion of people just wanted to have that kind of conversation with us about what can you do, and then ended up choosing none of the things. I mean, because sometimes people can't stake around for 4 hours. They got to go pick up their kids, or they need to get back to work, or they don't want their spouse to know where they are. So having that option of, well, nothing is just fine to choose, has turned out to be a really, really good thing. And as we have provided this service, we're coming up on 4 years now. We think we'll end up seeing about 700 people this year. And we are providing services in emergency departments in 4 surrounding counties and the one that we're in. Bless you. And we're also seeing folks at the University of Texas at their Student Health Services Center. That's an underutilized site, but we're glad to be able to go there to make it easier for people who don't want to come across town and see us.
Thank you.
So just to chime in as the advocacy person out there, it makes an incredible difference to be meeting somebody in the decision space. Send your imagination off visiting, right? So tell yourself this. I'm the friend of somebody who's just said, this thing happened, I think it was a really bad thing, I don't know what to do. Or maybe that's you. And the fact of the matter is, at this point, for many people, we as a program are able to open up a decision space that for practical purposes wasn't there before. So your imagination is off visiting. Your options are something like, well, do you call 311 and say, what do I do when this bad thing happens? Do you call 911 and say a bad thing happened? Do you go to your doctor's office, in which case they probably call the police or send you to the hospital? Do you go to the hospital and then, imagine yourself, you go up to the kind of the person at the triage desk and you say, hey, I was sexually assaulted. And then you go and talk to a triage nurse and say, hey, I was sexually assaulted. And you go and talk to your floor nurse and you say, hey, I was sexually assaulted. You talk to an MD, a PA, an NP, whoever's out there, hey, I was sexually assaulted. A bunch of people get called, a bunch of people get drawn in. All of a sudden, all of these steps later, you may have already given up your confidentiality without knowing it. You may have had somebody make the decision to involve law enforcement without you wanting to. And I think because of the model that we have, one way I think of it is the organizational needs are decoupled from individual people's needs. So the program can function as a program without really relying on people to make a certain choice, which if you're an advocate, if you're the person who's there to help people kind of navigate I don't have all the information for you, I can't guarantee what's going to happen in all these different possible things you might choose, but here's what I do know about that, here's what I do know about that, here's what I do know about that, let's talk about it. That's huge. That is so much more of a powerful position for us to be in as a staff and for people to be in as our clients, as our patients, than coming in sometimes, as Emily and Jenny have both said, 12 hours, days into the process. That's a lot of repair work to do, and there may be a bunch of options that are already gone at that point. If for no other reason than think about your physical stamina. If you work for 8 hours, you want to go home. If you've been shuttling back and forth between hospitals for 12 plus, and somebody says, oh, I know this great resource for you, you probably just want to go home and sleep. I think we can get people a lot more as we reach them earlier and help them kind of figure out, okay, which pieces of this are going to work for me? What's really going to be the thing that addresses my situation as I see it right now?
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to say I did hospital accompaniment in college. And I remember doing multiple transfers with survivors. You know, you go to one hospital, they don't provide contraception. You go to another one, the staff don't really understand the protocol. And so knowing that this is a program that takes all of that away, I think it's truly, truly amazing. And I think that just the conversation around asking folks what they need, collaborating on solutions, and not just here's what we can do for you, but more, you know, more of an empowering conversation, I think is such a great outcome of this program, for sure. So I want to ask a question. It's actually a two-part, because I want to make sure we have time for questions. This work is hard, as we talked about. We are a field of survivors as well, as we talked about before. What is your experience when it comes to secondary trauma and working within potentially traumatized organizations? How do you know you're in a traumatized organization? But to start, what is our experience with secondary trauma?
Should we just raise our hands?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can do this work and not experience secondary trauma. And secondary trauma is basically experiencing the same symptoms as if you were the one being traumatized, because you're in close proximity to it. So it's really common for friends and family of someone who's experienced a trauma. It's really really common for first responders, therapists, social workers, but all of us experience secondary trauma at some point. You know, if you've had a loved one get cancer or die or go through some sort of trauma of their own, you know what we're talking about. So I think certainly doing this work, we're going to experience secondary trauma if we have any sort of empathy, because we have feelings. For me, secondary trauma is what drove me into systems work. I was a therapist working with clients telling me their abuse stories and their rape stories, and I was feeling the same helplessness, hopelessness that they were feeling day in and day out, and thought, I've got to do something different. So for me, the way that I cope with secondary trauma is to do something different and to try to do something on a systems level to make it better for the survivors who come next. And in therapy, we tell clients, you know, something's traumatic because it doesn't fit into the filing cabinet of our brain. Our brain doesn't have the words to make sense of it, to file it away at where it belongs, which is why we have these ruminating thoughts that we can't quite describe. So I think saying the unsayable is really important when you experience secondary trauma, and on a systems level, you know, Brene Brown opened our festival, right? We have to speak truth to bullshit. So when the systems aren't doing what they're supposed to do, we have to be willing to name that and call it out and say, you know, we've got to do something different. Because as long as it stays unsayable, then it stays traumatic. And that's how systems themselves become traumatized. So for me, taking action, speaking truth to bullshit, and my personal lifeline is group text. I highly recommend everyone have a group text of your closest friends that you can rely on when you're feeling those symptoms.
So I did this work for 10 years before it occurred to me that I might think about getting a therapist, right? I am really good at compartmentalizing. I'm going to take this terrible thing that I had to hear at work, or these maybe 2 or maybe 3 really terrible stories that I had to hear at work on my 12-hour shift today, and I'm just going to put them in a box, and I'm going to put them over here, and I'm going to not think about it. Well, you know, that starts coming out sideways at some point. You know, I had colleagues when we were doing this work in the hospital who would remark on stopping to get gas in their car and getting back in the car and locking the doors while their tank was filling up. And I thought, well, I don't do that, I'm fine. And colleagues who said, you know, I can't sleep at night unless I go check and make sure all my windows and doors are locked. And I thought, well, that doesn't happen to me, so I must be fine. I had no idea how heavy the burden was of hearing, you know, I've taken care of about 1,100 people personally in my 10 or 12 years doing this work. And as a supervisor, I've listened to thousands of other stories as we review people's charts and as we help people improve their practices. And it just didn't dawn on me that I could use some help. And I'm happy to say that I have a wonderful therapist now and have for a couple of years. And I've also developed other personal practices that help ameliorate that secondary trauma. I'm a big fan of meditation. I can feel in my body when I'm exercising how it changes my mental health and my attitude about things. I like to garden. I really like heirloom tomatoes and bees, you know, so everybody has their own little personal things like that. And I want to talk a little bit about managing and supervising people who are doing this work. When I first started interviewing people to do this job, we'd say, oh gosh, you know, secondary trauma is a terrible thing and we're going to do everything to make sure that it doesn't happen for you. And that's not realistic. When we interview people, part of our first conversation is we want to make sure that you have a therapist before you start training to do this work. Can't make you do it, but it'd be awesome if you did. So that's where it begins for me as a supervisor, to make sure that people understand what they're walking into, how it can affect them personally, and what resources there are in the community that are available to do something about it. We have also enlisted the help of our employee assistance program and have a counselor come in regularly to our staff meetings who can do like critical incident stress debriefs with our nurses, because every encounter is a critical incident stress sort of a situation. It's not like we're in private practice counseling where every now and again you might have somebody that you're taking care of who's feeling suicidal or homicidal or having something extreme. It's all extreme. Every contact we have with a patient, you're listening to something that is, maybe the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And we're listening empathetically. And my daughter Kate, when I started doing this work, said, Mom, you kind of give people a soft place to land. And there's an emotional cost for doing that. But it's a wonderful model, and I'm really glad that we're able to think about our work in this way.
Yeah, some of the things that I think about are echoing your point, Emily, one of your points, that trauma, not only is it something that dwells in the sort of unsayable realm, it's also amnestic, right? We love to forget about it culturally, individually. We like to put it in a place where it doesn't seem to exist, or it doesn't seem to exist within language. And I think part of the way that you see your way towards dealing with the secondary trauma involved in doing the work is figuring out whatever place it's going to be, however you're going to do it as an individual, as an organization, as a supervisor. How are you going to build a place where you're able to tell the truth about that? Where you're able to not have to forget things, or not have to kind of sanitize things or fit them into some part of your thinking where they don't actually go. I also think a lot about, this is Martha Nussbaum, female philosopher, brilliant woman. She talks about, in a political context, broader than this, she says, in order to have a decent society, people have to be able to do more than rely on their institutions and their fellow citizens. People actually have to be able to have trust. And I think of that as a useful way of thinking about it for the way that we have our relationships with each other in this work. It's one thing to be able to rely on somebody who will always behave in the same way. This charge nurse will yell at me every time I ask for anything. That's a known quantity. Jenny will always be nice to me. That's a known quantity. But it's another thing to be able to build and really be intentional about building trust so that we know that we can connect. We know that we can connect. And that kind of thinking in terms of relationships rather than sort of these, I don't know what the right word for it is, but something a little bit narrower than that, these interactions where you're my patient, I'm your service provider, but more like how can we think about the way that we're related to each other? That's another answer, I think, to trauma, which is going to tend to be disconnecting. It's going to tend to pull us apart from one another. Think about those things too.
Yeah, just as a side thought, nursing school drove me crazy because it was all about this therapeutic distance that you were to cultivate between yourself and your patients. And I was a grown-up when I went to nursing school. I didn't do it straight out of high school. And I couldn't understand that. I thought it's in between people, in the relationship, in what happens where all the juicy magic stuff happens. It was a little hard for me to fit into the healthcare model, but I'm so grateful to have landed where we are.
Did you, were there any further thoughts just about a traumatized system and addressing or changing a system that has become traumatized?
Yeah, I think it's not uncommon at all for systems, full of people who've experienced trauma or who have worked day in and day out with people who've experienced trauma to become traumatized systems that also feel helpless and have black and white thinking and have limited choices. And that certainly has happened in the systems of sexual assault response all over the country. You can pick any news source you want and you'll see some article about a system that has failed because it's become traumatized. And we were no different. We are no different here in Austin. So I think it's something we have to think a lot about. But I think the most important things are the same things we talk about individually with clients who have been traumatized, right? We have to keep the best interest of survivors as our North Star. And if everyone working in that system can agree that we are all there for the best interest of survivors and keep that as our North Star, and it's not about me and my trauma, it's not about you and your trauma, it's not about power, it's not about control, it's about how do we make the system better for survivors, then we can get out of that stuck place. And I think, just like survivors dealing with their own trauma, those systems have to be able to name what's wrong and be able to talk about it, and they have to stay at the table and have really hard conversations. I've been most traumatized by conversations I was never able to have. And I see lots of heads nodding. If you think about the parent or the boyfriend or the girlfriend or the whoever, that caused the most rift for you, the most personal pain for you, the most trauma for you, it's often a conversation we weren't able to have because we weren't able to name it or say what we needed to say to put it in the filing cabinet and move on. And I find that to be true of our systems as well. Where I get stuck as a professional is when I'm not able to have the hard conversations. Even though they really suck, we've got to be willing to say survivors are the most important, and we're going to rise above our trauma as a system and keep survivors as our North Star to make it better.
Thank you for saying that. I think it's so important that first we're talking about sexual violence as a social issue, a social problem, and that violence is a tool of oppression, right? And we have all these systems that keep folks from getting the support and services they need, create barriers for healing. And so this is a conversation that allows us to dig into actually addressing those systems that put people in harm's way. And I think about how trauma for different people is very layered, right? So folks dealing with violence in their community is a level of trauma. You have, of course, experiencing a crisis. You have social isolation if you think about like LGBTQ folks. So I definitely see this conversation of trauma-informed care being much broader than the crisis. What kind of other ways do you see us having a conversation that's inclusive of historical trauma and the different barriers that different people are facing?
Anybody else want to start? I think we have to realize that there's not a cookie-cutter way to respond to sexual assault survivors. I think everyone comes in with different layers of oppression, and that, just like any movement, we got better at responding to white female survivors first. And we haven't done such or as good a job as responding to communities of color. And so I think, the first thing we've got to do is realize not everyone has the same experience, and so the response can't be the same. And I think we made good ground when we started Eloise House in that we broke down some of the barriers and people had options for the first time. It wasn't just, you do this. This is your only path to healing. But I think, the future of trauma-informed care is to honor everyone's experience as different and make the response individualized to that person and their background and their needs, which means that we've got to get better as systems of adapting and changing and not see change as loss. Especially traumatized systems, I think, sometimes feel any change as a bad thing. And we need to view it as growth instead. And just because it's the way we did it 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, doesn't mean it's what survivors today need. And maybe it's, maybe we keep that option and add some more to it. But I think, the way we get better at responding to survivors is to recognize individuals and stop trying to put people into boxes, or fit them into the way we provide services instead of meeting them wherever their needs may be.
Thank you.
One of the really lovely things about having this program live in the agency that it lives in and has the people in it that are working in it is that we have been able to listen to what the people we're taking care of want, and we've been able to respond to that. When we were, I don't know, maybe 6 or 9 months in, one of the nurses came to me and said, hey, we need to do some follow-up with people. We need to do some kind of a case management sort of a thing, because people have needs that extend past this 4-hour encounter that we're having with them. People need housing, people need safety, people need, some medical thing came up and they need to have a connection with a provider that we didn't think of when we were with them. And so we were able to begin at that time to build a case management system. It's almost where we want it now. We are able to provide follow-up calls and contacts with people and respond to those from the patients that we've seen in order to get them what they need after we've taken care of them. And that's just lovely.
Thank you.
So back in the direction of setting the conditions for people to have relationships with each other, I think that ends up being a big part of your question, addressing it. Like, how is it? There are a number of experiences that any of us as individual providers are not going to bring to the table. And the idea of having a representative of the community that you're from be your service provider is a good one, but it's just not going to be realistic in practice. The thing that I feel like we're able to get closer to, if I open up that space and we're able to talk more about what's fitting, what's not fitting, what do you want, what do you need, there's room for, I think, more to be on the table, whether that's things that I, as a patient or client, can say outright, like, I'm uncomfortable in this situation because of this, that, or the other thing. I also think there's room to pick it up and sort of something's not working about this. And because I'm not busy trying to get somebody else's system to try to get the critical things done for you, I actually, as an advocate in our current model, generally have time to really go slowly. Like, something about this not working for you? Is there anything that we can do to make you feel less scary? I mean, this is a scary place, but anything in particular coming up? I think that's a big part of it. I think that just from the boots on the ground level, I think that's how you start to see, okay, well, so this is what people need. We need to do things differently. And I think the fact that we're having that conversation in something that looks more like a living room and less like an emergency department is a huge part of that. It's certainly not going to solve everything, but I think it's gotten us a step or two closer.
Thank you. So I'll ask this last question, and then I want to open it up for questions. We have a mic there, or you can just, if you feel like you can project, you can just talk or ask. The last one is, what is your advice for folks that want to practice radical empathy where they are? What would you tell folks that are coming into a system like this?
I think my answer is always something like, you're going to have to hold on to your core principles in this, because the environments that you work in are, just by the nature of trauma itself, they're going to pull on that. They're going to try to, there's going to be a tendency for you to lose sight of the things that are really important, and maybe even the things that are really going on in front of you. I think that's going to look different for different disciplines. I'm not saying that everybody should be a student of philosophy, although it would solve some problems. But that's certainly where it's been for me. How do I equip my mind to have some defenses around, okay, what's actually ethical, what's actually possible, what's actually politically possible, where am I in all that? I think without that, I would have been lost a really long time ago. That said, if my therapist were here, she would say, "Oh, you're being pretty thinky there, Andrea." So the relational aspect of the work, I think, without having some access to people you can be really honest with, wherever they happen to be. I mean, I think seeking good supervision is just huge in this work. Wherever the honest space is going to be, you'll need it.
I would say if you want to practice radical empathy on a systems level, start by doing your own work. and take care of yourself there, and then build a good support network, get a nice solid group text going with at least 2 of your favorite people. And then don't be limited by other people's beliefs about what empathy should look like or what advocacy should look like. Dream big, take action. Radical empathy is about saying the unsayable and taking action to fix it. So be brave, be willing to do that, and don't forget who you are in the process. And that's where the people on the other end of the group text come in really handy.
For me, it required identifying the burr under my saddle, right? I was really disturbed at my experience as a healthcare provider in a hospital system. I didn't care for the way that I was treated, and I really didn't care for the way that our patients were treated. So that thing that bothered me so much, I've been able to knacker it up like a pearl, and we have built this beautiful system of response to sexual assault survivors here in Austin. So I think that maybe we're a good place to start. What is it that you don't like about what's going on, and what can you do about it? You have to understand your own ethics. You have to be clear about what you're capable of. Sort of. We did a lot of things that we didn't think that we could do, and none of us slept very much for the first 3 years. But we had more capacity than we thought we did. We dreamed big, we swung high, and we knocked it over the fence. So understanding what it is that you want to change in a really specific manner, and cultivating the relationships around you that you need to be able to birth that change into reality. And then having all of the support, and having your people, and having, your therapist, and your exercise, and your tomatoes, whatever it is that you need to keep yourself floating doing difficult work day after day. Because if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to burn yourself to a crisp, and you won't be able to be effective at all.
The last thing I would add to that is to be really careful about your language. When you work with survivors, you get used to hearing things about abuse and about trauma and about feeling unsafe. And it's really important that at a systems level, we're really cognizant not to co-opt that language. So know the difference between unsafe and uncomfortable, and get used to being uncomfortable, because you're going to be uncomfortable a lot. But respect the experience of the survivors you're working with, and be willing to know the difference.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, Safe Alliance, the ladies up here, the work you're doing is groundbreaking. And the idea that survivors of violence have a seat at the table, and changing some of the systems that can be re-traumatizing, that can reproduce some of the same inequalities that exist. Having the seat at the table is healing in itself. So I see that as a definite strength of this program. So with that, are there any questions from the audience?
First, I just want to say you're all amazing empathy warriors.
Thank you.
I'm going to add that to my resume now.
Yes, empathy warriors.
Yes. Thank you.
So I work for a publishing company that does a lot with a ton of trauma healing professionals. Mindfulness meditation, all kinds of tools that you're talking about. One thing that I'm interested in doing is publishing books, actually multimedia, but I'm actually really interested in what is a good resource for that kind of follow-up that you're talking about. I know there's a lot of good books out there. I think there's Eloise House, I think it's, doorstop. Totally 20th century amazing resource. And then there's a lot of, I've been looking into this, and when I get book proposals sometimes from people doing amazing work, they're re-traumatizing. The content is re-traumatizing to read. So, what would be useful to your clients that would not be a re-traumatizing resource that would help them? I mean, that's a huge, broad question. But like, if you could say, oh, here, you could take this with you and it would help you. What does that look like?
I can add one, and I think And I think it's really hard to say what's not going to re-traumatize. I think the nature of trauma is that's complicated to decide. But I think The Body Keeps the Score is a really good kind of comprehensive book to read about trauma. If you want something more culturally resonant, My Grandmother's Hands does a good job of tying together like historical trauma for people of color, as well as complex and then different types of trauma.
Yeah, I think it depends on the survivor. So some people need the courage to heal. They need, to see other people have experienced these symptoms, and this is what my body's doing. Same with, Waking the Tiger and The Body Keeps the Score. But then there's another whole level of survivors who they know what's happening to them. They don't need to read about it again. They need something kind of higher level. Or they need something inspirational just to know how to connect with other people, which is where, I send people to Brene Brown all the time. She's not talking about sexual assault and what happens to her body and all of that, but she talks about empathy and compassion and how to relate to other people, and does a beautiful job of kind of showing that our experiences are universal in a way that a survivor can take the piece she needs to hear. I heard several people who heard Brene speak on Friday, was it? I missed it, but several people have said to me, at the first 20 minutes, I thought she was speaking to me. So, and that's been my experience counseling clients too. So I think we need good, practical, these are the symptoms of trauma, this is what happens in your body, and this is what you do with them, although I think there are several good resources for that out there. But we also need some universal, we all experience trauma, and it doesn't make you weird or broken, and you can still succeed and be a leader and achieve your dreams. So I would encourage more of the latter and less of the, here's a list of symptoms to look out for, because we already have that handout. We hand them as they walk out of the clinic.
I'm kind of imagining a book where the chapters are basically like, if this is the thing that makes you feel isolated, disconnected from people, read this chapter. If this is the thing that makes you feel isolated, read this chapter. If this is the thing, wherever the hopelessness is, the I don't have words for it is, I don't know. If you make that book, I will definitely recommend it. What is it? What is it that's, the person picking up this book, like, what is it that's making you feel stuck? Is it really practical? Is it like, I need to figure out how to regulate my sleep because this is not working for me? Is it, God, that probably the single most common thing that I feel like I hear in my work is, somebody else had it way worse than me, so this shouldn't matter. Like, that could be a huge chapter. And I don't know that a book is ultimately going to unlock those doors, but at the very least, if it's somebody who's in the resource mode of, I want this to happen between myself and some pages, then I think that could be huge. Offering somebody the opportunity to interact with whoever's voice it's going to be, who's going to say, well, okay, here's how I overcame that. Here's what it looked like for me. I think that could be really big. So keep us posted.
Right. Two tiny things. Everybody that comes in to see us thinks that they're to blame. So if we could start with that one. Yeah. I tell the patients that I see, if I could relieve you of this one burden, it would be, you didn't do anything wrong here. There's nothing you should have done. There's nothing you should not have done. The responsibility for this act lies 100% with the person who chose to do it and 0% with you. So if we could take that self-blame out of the picture, because we get those messages everywhere. Why were you there? What were you wearing? All of that stupid stuff. And the second piece is, you're not broken. Right. Something terrible and awful happened to you, but it doesn't mean anything about who you are. And how we assign meaning to things can be really harmful sometimes. This doesn't mean anything. It means that something bad happened, that's all. Mm-hmm.
And one more question.
How can we work together to be supportive of the real fact and truth that if you don't necessarily tell your story right away, you're, as we all know, like years and years and years. And I'm just so tired of reading that, even though we know that and people are saying that, there is this powerful force that's designed to say, well, if you didn't tell it right away, then, so I'm really putting a lot of energy into the whole issue of statute of limitations and feeling that that's the fight for the policy place to begin. But I'm wondering, as experts, what you think about where to kind of put, there's only so much energy, so like what level does one find that? Medium policy, like, you know?
That's a great question.
For me, it goes back to that, finding alternative systems and alternative processes than what we currently have. So, even statute of limitations, yes, that might extend the legal criminal justice option for survivors, but for the survivor who didn't tell her story for 20 years, who finally finds the strength to do so, she probably needs some other options too. And I think those have to extend beyond just one-on-one counseling. I'm a therapist. I love one-on-one counseling. I'm all for it. But if we could find some other alternative, there's some restorative justice models kind of in the works that, hopefully will show some promise, but some other ways for the community to come together to rally around survivors, to provide other paths to healing that may or may not include a criminal justice component, I think are important. I think we get so focused on criminal justice that we forget that there's a whole other piece to the survivor's healing that has to happen, and that we heal in community. So the more ways we can provide connection for survivors whenever they choose to identify themselves as survivors, I think is kind of where we need to go. I know that's vague, but more ways to connect, more ways to heal as a community.
And if I'm hearing you right, to make it real, right? I mean, I feel like that's where criminal justice so often comes in. It's I want somebody to say that this really happened and it was really so wrong that now somebody else has to have a penalty imposed on them because of the fact that they did it. It's big. I don't think it's going away. I don't think it's, and it has problems. People are doing that work. It's important. But, I can remember so many conversations. I used to work on a hotline advocate, sort of like technical support for this kind of thing. And the number of conversations that I've had doing that work where it's something like, did it count if the court let this person off? Because this person wasn't arrested, is it not real? And I wish there was a way to say, no, it's really real. It's not a fake thing. It's not, I'm kind of waiting for whatever the alternative is, where we get together as a community and say, no, this really happened. Really happened. Really not okay. Really our job now to figure out how to be there for you, whatever that's going to look like. Gosh, I don't know. I feel like I'm going to have to work a lot harder.
All right, so I think we're out of time. We are out of time. And I thank you so much for the conversation. I liked what you used, empathy warriors or something like that, so thank you so much to the panel and for your expertise here. And like I said, we will be available after if anyone has questions or wants to engage in some way or wants to talk a little bit more. And I did think about a literacy moment. Safe Alliance is the local crisis center that houses Eloise House. CASA of Travis County is court-appointed special. What is it?
Court-appointed special advocates.
There we go. Works with young people. All right. Well, thank you so much for having us. Enjoy the rest of South by.